The world had watched Lupita Nyong'o stand on that Oscar stage in 2014, smiling with grace and confidence, her name echoing through the halls of Hollywood. But you won't believe what was going on behind that beautiful smile. Let me tell you, while the cameras flashed and the crowd cheered, she was living a private pain that very few people knew about. That same year of her biggest victory was also the year she received news that would change her life. She had been diagnosed with uterine fibroids. At first, she kept it locked away, telling only a few close friends, thinking it was something she could silently handle. But this is where it gets interesting. The reason she stayed silent was not just personal. It was because society had taught her, like so many women, to believe that painful periods and heavy bleeding were simply a part of being a woman. For years, she carried this burden while continuing to work, smile, and inspire millions. But deep down, the symptoms were growing worse. She suffered from intense cramps, bloating, fatigue, and moments of dizziness that she brushed aside because she thought she had to keep going. What makes this story different is that it wasn't only about her pain. It was about millions of women, especially Black women, who were facing the same condition but staying quiet, thinking they had no choice. The craziest part was that fibroids affected so many, yet almost no one talked about them openly. And here is the shocking part. Even doctors often dismiss these symptoms, calling them normal or nothing serious, while inside the pain was destroying their energy, health, and even their dreams of having children. Lupita had felt that same dismissal. She had gone to doctors who brushed off her concerns, telling her to take painkillers and rest. But she knew something wasn't right. Still, she hid it from the public eye. Her Instagram and interviews showed a woman living her dream, but away from the spotlight, she was planning her days around her pain, calculating how to push through filming schedules without letting anyone see her weakness. Destiny took an unexpected turn when one night, after a long day on set, she collapsed on her bed, clutching her stomach, realizing she could not keep silent forever. It was then that she started thinking, if she, with all her fame and resources, felt ignored and dismissed, what about the women who didn't have a voice, who didn't have access to the best medical care? That thought began to grow inside her, planting the seed for a movement she never planned to lead, but one she knew she could no longer avoid. The more Lupita thought about it, the more she realized her silence was helping no one. She remembered the years she had accepted the pain as part of her life, forcing herself to smile through red carpets, interviews, and endless filming schedules. This is how the cycle continued for so many women. They learned to hide their suffering so well that even their closest friends didn't know the truth. But here's the shocking part. While fibroids are not cancer, they can completely change a woman's life. Heavy bleeding that leaves you weak, pelvic pain so intense you can't stand straight, and bloating that makes you feel like a stranger in your own body. Yet, millions of women still thought this was normal. Lupita began reading more, searching for answers, and what she found left her stunned. Studies showed that Black women were not only more likely to develop fibroids, but their symptoms were often more severe, starting earlier in life and growing faster. The craziest part, medical research still didn't know why. And because there was so little funding and awareness, new treatments were rare, and the same old invasive surgeries were being offered as the main solution. This is where it gets interesting. Lupita discovered that many women were being told their only option was a hysterectomy, a surgery that removes the uterus and takes away the chance of having children forever. She thought about all the young women who might have dreams of becoming mothers, only to be told their wombs had to be removed because no one had invested in better treatments. What makes this story different is that Lupita had the platform to speak up. She could call attention to the problem, but for years, she hadn't. Now, the guilt of staying quiet weighed heavy on her. She remembered one conversation with a friend who told her about missing work for weeks because of fibroid pain, only to be told by her employer that she needed to toughen up. It made Lupita realize how deep the stigma ran. It wasn't just the medical system ignoring women, it was the entire culture. She began to imagine what could happen if she shared her story. Maybe it would encourage other women to talk, to push for better care, to demand change. But there was still fear of being judged, of being pitied, of having her personal life dissected by the media. And yet, Destiny had already pushed her to a point where silence was no longer an option. She knew that if she didn't speak now, countless women would continue to suffer in the shadows, just as she had. Her decision was almost made, but she also knew once she said the words out loud, there would be no turning back. When Lupita finally decided to speak, it wasn't with a press conference or a magazine interview. Instead, she opened her phone, typed out her truth, and shared it on Instagram during Fibroid Awareness Month. You won't believe the wave it created. Within minutes, comments began flooding in, women from all over the world telling her, "I've been through this too." Some wrote about years of being misdiagnosed, others about losing their ability to have children because they hadn't been given other treatment options. Lupita read each message with a heavy heart, realizing her story was only a small part of something much bigger. But here is the shocking part. Many of the women who messaged her had never spoken about it publicly before. Her post had given them the courage to break their own silence. This is where it gets interesting. Lupita's confession didn't just bring attention to fibroids, it exposed a deep and ongoing neglect in women's healthcare. She started getting calls from reporters, health organizations, and even lawmakers who wanted to talk about the issue. What had once been a private pain was now becoming a public conversation, and she was at the center of it. She began partnering with advocacy groups, lending her voice to campaigns that pushed for more research funding, better education for doctors, and insurance coverage for newer, less invasive treatments. The craziest part was that these efforts were already beginning to reach people. Hospitals were holding awareness seminars, schools were including reproductive health in their talks, and social media was filling with stories from women who finally felt seen. Lupita knew there was still a long way to go, but she had crossed the line from silent sufferer to outspoken advocate. Destiny took an unexpected turn. The same fame that had once forced her to hide her pain was now the very tool she used to shine a light on it. She wasn't just an actress anymore. She had become a fighter for women's health, a voice for those who had none. And as the movement grew, one thing became clear to her. Speaking up was only the first step. The real battle was just beginning. As Lupita's voice grew louder, so did the pressure on those in power. She began working with legislators to push for bills that would increase funding for fibroid research, expand access to less invasive treatments, and ensure doctors took women's symptoms seriously. You won't believe how quickly the conversation shifted once her story reached national headlines. Doctors who had once brushed off patients were suddenly facing questions. Politicians who had never spoken about women's reproductive health were now being asked where they stood on the issue. But here's the shocking part. Even with all this attention, there were still countless women suffering in silence, unable to afford proper care or even get an accurate diagnosis. This is where it gets interesting. Lupita realized the fight wasn't just about awareness, it was about changing a system that had failed women for generations. She pushed for community outreach programs, mobile clinics, and educational campaigns that would teach women the symptoms that should never be ignored. The craziest part was seeing how her single act of honesty had started a chain reaction. Celebrities, activists, and everyday women were stepping forward to share their own experiences, building a movement that stretched across countries and cultures. What makes this story different is that it didn't fade away after a few weeks of headlines. It grew stronger. Women began demanding second opinions, questioning their doctors, and refusing to accept pain as just part of being a woman. Destiny took an unexpected turn. What began as Lupita's personal struggle had turned into a powerful force for change. She had faced the fear of judgment, pushed past the stigma, and transformed her pain into purpose. And as she stood before a crowd at a women's health rally, she told them the words that had become her mission: silence saves no one. The applause was loud, but even louder was the hope in the hearts of the women listening. Because now they knew they weren't alone, and the world could no longer pretend not to hear them.